As you know, today is Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. He would have been 86 years old. But even though Dr. King no longer walks among us, today and every day, he still speaks to us. His words are engraved on our monument in the national capital, move us to continue demanding a more just and more equal society. And his voice, echoing in all of our own minds, inspires each of us to ask of himself or herself, am I doing all that I can do to help my fellow human being? The day before he died, Dr. King delivered what today is one of his most well-known speeches, where he famously declared, I have been to the mountaintop. And in that speech, he spoke about a man who was robbed traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. Lying destitute on the road, he's passed by both a priest and a Levite, before finally a Samaritan comes along who tends to the man's wounds and takes him in. We all know the story well. But Dr. King presents a slightly different version of the parable. He tells us that the road from Jericho to Jerusalem was incredibly dangerous back in those days. Steep, windy road where attacks and ambushes were common. Dr. King asked us to consider perhaps the priest and the Levite were scared. Maybe they thought the bandits who robbed this man lying on the road were still around and would attack them if they stopped to help him. Maybe they feared the man was only pretending to be injured. And so Dr. King tells us in that moment, as they passed this stranger lying in the street, the priest and the Levite asked themselves, if I stop for this man, what will happen to me? But the Samaritan turns the question around and he asked of himself, if I do not stop for this man, what will happen to him? Dr. King does not tell this version of the Good Samaritan parable to excuse the inaction of the first two men. Rather, it's a reminder to each and every one of us that sometimes doing the right thing is not easy. Life is busy. It's full of personal hardships. It's full of struggles. It can be all too easy, even for the well-intentioned person, to become bogged down in questions like, what will happen to me? The greatest thing we can do to honor the legacy of Martin Luther King is to look around us at the most vulnerable members of society and ask ourselves, if we do not help these people, what will happen to them? The Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami expressed a similar sentiment when he said, between a high, solid wall and an egg that breaks against it, I will always stand on the side of the egg. No matter how wrong the wall might be, I will stand with the egg because every life is precious. Every individual matters. And every day in this city and around the world, we see eggs coming up against high, solid walls. A boy in South Los Angeles struggling to overcome a wall of gangs and violence. A young woman in South Sudan trying to spread messages of peace against a wall of civil war and bloodshed. Or an African-American man in New York City who might end up dead because he gets into a disagreement with a law enforcement agent and comes up against a wall of discrimination and brutality. If we do not stand with these people, the most vulnerable among us, what will happen to them? Today, I'm proud to stand with the MLK Community Health Foundation and the people of South Los Angeles in celebrating the upcoming opening of the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Hospital. South Los Angeles is one of the most vulnerable communities in the nation. Every day, people in this community struggle against a wall of poverty, a wall of lack of opportunity, a wall of violence, a wall of a shortage of quality health care. I witnessed this growing up. My parents raised me in a house on East 49th Street, just a few miles from where MLK Hospital will be opening. And I remember one time, my little brother and I were in the playground and he fell off the jungle gym and he broke his arm. I didn't know what to do. But my mom came and we took him to the county hospital. It was a long wait. My brother was crying in agony for the whole time. But finally we were able to see a doctor. My mom spent the day filling out paperwork that seemed to be going on and making her upset. And I understood this later, and she was worried because we didn't have any health insurance. Finally, my dad got there and he was able to take things underhand. But I always remember how crowded the waiting rooms that day. And I wonder, whenever I think of this story, how things turned out for all of those people that were there. Years later, we're in 2013. About 30% of adults in South Los Angeles, almost 1 in 3, still have no regular source of health care, one of the most basic and fundamental of human needs. This is a serious problem for a society that prides itself on equality of opportunity. Because if you do not have access to health care, if you have to spend your energy worrying about what will happen if you get sick or how you will be able to afford to visit a doctor, how can you possibly have the same opportunity to succeed as those that do? Indeed, there's a fundamental, holistic relationship between peace, economic progress, health, and education. You cannot have any of these things without the other. The Martin Luther King Jr. Community Hospital will not only make South Los Angeles a more healthy community, it will make it a more peaceful one as well. This hospital will tear down the walls that hold back people in this community. In the coming year, the MLK Community Health Foundation will also launch UCAN, an important educational initiative that will bring health and science enrichment to local elementary schools. This year, I'll be working with one of these schools, Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary, to turn around arts, which is a federal program that seeks to turn around underachieving schools through arts enrichment programs. Now, I've seen firsthand how effective programs like these can be at tearing down walls of oppression, whether they're here in Los Angeles or in Mexico, Uganda, or South Sudan, where my foundation, the Whitaker Peace and Development Initiative, also operates. Those programs empower youth as they truly make young people that are at risk in communities believe that their lives have potential, that they have them will take them outside of this culture of poverty, this culture of violence that many of them have been brought up in. Your support for this hospital and for the programs of the MLK Community Health Foundation is invaluable, because every single one of us has an important role to play in improving our communities and bringing down walls. We can never let the scope of the challenges of the busyness of our own lives be excuses for our inaction. When we see those people who need our help, we must ask ourselves, what will happen to them if we do nothing? Small act of goodness can cause ripples that are felt on the other side of the world. The records of human history are filled with examples when a single person stood up to injustice and made a difference. A woman on a bus in Montgomery standing up against a wall of segregation, or a man in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square standing up against a wall of suppression. These famous acts of courage changed the world. Now the thing is, inconspicuous acts of courage can matter just as much. When we look at the black and white photographs from the civil rights era, it's easy to spot the Martin Luther Kings or the Rosa Parks, but we often overlook those anonymous faces marching alongside them in the crowd. Those ordinary men and women standing up for what they knew was right. Oftentimes they acted at great personal risk. Maybe they would lose their jobs, maybe they'd be beaten, maybe they would be killed. But still they asked themselves how they could make the world a better place. And they pressed their fingers onto the scale, on the right side of the scale of justice. Who's to say who was the person who ultimately tipped the scale, who finally brought down those walls, took all of them working together to change the world? Because now, 50 years later, we see the photographs that they left behind, and we look at the world around us, and we know that they made a difference, that they made history. So then there's the question, what walls will we bring down? We need to look at ourselves in the photographs taken today and ask ourselves what we stand for. All around us, our brothers and sisters lie on the side of the road waiting for a good Samaritan to come along. We must ask ourselves what will happen to them if we do nothing. Always remember that there are so many different ways to change the world. Individually, each one of us can stand up against a wall. And if we stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters, then together we can bring those walls down. Thank you again to the MLK Community Health Foundation for recognizing me here today. I'm humbled, and I thank you all for honoring Dr. King's legacy, for everything that you've done to make the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Hospital a reality. Thank you.